All right, so welcome. This is the last in a series of 4 lunchtime seminars from the Active Living Census. And this particular session will focus on healthy eating and food security, specifically on the Macedon Ranges. We'll also share some regional results and we'll look at sort of how we fit in to what's going on within the region and drilling it down as well into what's going on across our shire and within communities within our shire as well. So I'd like to start off acknowledging that Macedon Ranges Shire is on Dja Dja Wurrung, Tangarang and Wurundjeri countries. And I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who might be here today. As I mentioned, this is the 4th in a series of 4 seminars. Particularly draw your attention to the first one on understanding and using the Active Living Census. And when I make these video recordings available, you might be interested in going back to have a look at that to really get the most out of the data in the census. In that session, we really described a little bit more around the questions that were asked, the sampling, and how representative it is of the population as well, which is key, I guess, to really getting the most out of this really rich resource. So today, with the focus on healthy eating and food security, we'll talk about guidelines for fruit and veg consumption and barriers to meeting those guidelines. Talk a little bit about the consumption of water and sugary drinks and some information on food insecurity as well. So very briefly, for particularly those who might not have attended the other sessions, the Active Living Census is a survey on health and wellbeing. It had a focus on recreational activity, but included a whole host of wellbeing questions. The Active Living Census was conducted across the Loddon Campaspe region as part of the Healthy Heart of Victoria initiative. So we distributed this survey to all households within the 6 participating local government areas. So they all received a paper copy by mail and were invited to complete the survey online if they wanted or preferred. That was really encouraged. So all in all, we received just under 25,000 people participated across the Loddon Campaspe region and over 3,500 Macedon Ranges, so about 8. I might just start a quick reminder to put yourself on mute if not already, just to eliminate any of those background sounds. Thank you. All right, so a little reminder of what we asked about, and in bold there are the questions that we will focus on in today's healthy eating and food security session. We also collected a whole lot of demographic information shown there in the left-hand column. And that means that we can consider, with this volume of responses that we received, we can consider differences in health and wellbeing for people based on where they live, on their age, on their gender, on other personal characteristics, or other township characteristics as well. So that gives us a really powerful data set that we've never had before. A little reminder of fruit and veg consumption guidelines. And I'm going to put my hand up and admit that I would have told you go for 2 and 5 for adults. And what I've learned through putting this together is that actually for males from adolescence up to the age of 70, there's a higher requirement for vegetable consumption than for females of a similar age. And that's explained to be due to a range of factors. I won't pretend to be a nutritionist, but it's partly gender related as well as other requirements. So for that reason, I'm going to present the data both for having 5 or more serves of vegetables, as well as for meeting requirements. So first of all, just to look at serves of vegetables that our residents are eating per day. And we can see that majority will be eating vegetables, but not meeting the 5 or more serves per day. And the picture is similar in the region to what we see here in Macedon Ranges Shire. So exactly the same, in fact, that 54% were sort of the majority of 2 to 4 serves, and that we see just over a quarter having no serves at all or less than 2. Average number of serves was very similar across the Loddon Campaspe region to what we see here in Macedon Ranges. 2.8 for Loddon Campaspe and 2.9 serves per day here in Macedon Ranges. There wasn't a lot of variation across the region. high vegetable consumption or a high proportion of people meeting the guidelines in Mount Alex than other areas in the Shire. So what the colours here show are the pink line is the 5 or more serves, and the green bars is meeting guidelines. And they're separated out, as I mentioned, just because for males from adolescence to age 70, there was that higher requirement. So depending on what sort of data you're interested in or use or promote, those two pieces of information can be kind of considered together, and both are included there in our report. Looking within our Shire, we didn't see any differences according to where people live. That didn't determine whether or not they met the guidelines. There's a bit of a pattern there that you can see where it looks as though there's a high proportion of people in Lancefield who are not meeting guidelines, but that difference didn't meet statistical significance. So that means, we know there's a little bit of fuzziness around all of the numbers that we present, and wherever there's an arrow presented here on the slide, that indicates that it was a statistically, sorry, I always stumble over that, statistically significant difference. So we can say with confidence that it's not due to chance, or there's a 99% probability it's not due to chance alone. So we really want to put most of our emphasis and our weight where we see those arrows and really be confident in the data and those differences in informing our decisions about where to next. We do start to see some patterns in vegetable consumption, some gender differences. However, when we look at the picture for males across the lifespan, that drop that you see in adolescence is largely due to that increased vegetable requirement in adolescence. So actually the proportion who are having 5 or more serves, when we compare that males to females, it's quite a similar picture. So there's obviously not this knowledge within the community of that increased requirement from adolescence up to age 70. Other than that, males generally had slightly lower consumption than females, but we see most of the differences when we start to drill down into different within our community. So there was less people meeting the guidelines who also reported poor health, people who said they didn't feel valued by society, people who'd gone without food at least once in the past year and couldn't afford to buy more, so we're calling that food insecurity, and also among people who were found to be overweight and obese according to their body mass index. This picture that we see here in this slide, you'll see carried through for a number of the health and wellbeing indicators, where we see that same pattern with some of those social determinants of health and the outcomes that we see. Interestingly, there is also a bit of clustering with other health behaviours. So people who didn't meet vegetable consumption guidelines were likely to have a poor diet generally, so they also didn't meet the fruit consumption guidelines. They might have had sugary drinks every day. They might have had daily alcohol consumption or binge drinking, smokers, and people generally who didn't meet the physical activity guidelines either. So this real clustering of poor health. I'm going to look at a slightly different take on this now. If we looked at those with who are not getting getting less of the nutritional benefit of vegetables, so having less than 2 serves, 0 or 1 serves of vegetable per day. So that's really lowering the threshold, We obviously want to promote and want as many people in our Shire as possible to be meeting the guidelines. But who are those who are not even getting 2 serves per day? I think that's a really important starting point to consider and can start to unmask some of those disadvantages as well. So when we look across the region, we see that although 26% of adults in Macedon Ranges were having less than 2 serves of veg a day, that's significantly lower than Central Goldfield Shire, where 35% of people weren't having at least 2 serves of veg a day. When we look within our Shire across districts, we do see a difference according to where people live, where 1/3 of people in Romsey were having less than 2 serves of veg a day, which was significantly higher than in Macedon Woodend, where it was 1 in 5 people. Again, when we start to look at who is it who's missing out on these veg according to their characteristics, their social circumstances, we see that significantly bigger problem for people with poor or fair health, people who aren't valued by society, a new issue emerging, people who require assistance with daily activities, and again, those who are food insecure. So I think what really jumps out here is that half of all people who have gone without food at some stage in the past year because they couldn't afford to buy more are having fewer than 2 serves of veg per day. So really unmasking those food and financial insecurities and implications for having a healthy diet, which we know is so important for good health and well-being. Very similar pattern that the low vegetable consumption, it kind of occurs together with poor diet generally, with smoking and with low physical activity. So we had a question that posed to people, the health experts recommend that we eat 5 serves of vegetables a day. If you don't do this, then why not? Can you give us the top reasons why not? And these were actually presented as categories. So they're not purely open-ended responses, but there was another category where people could provide a different response. So we see for this that for adults across the Shire, being time poor is the number one reason they put forward for not meeting the guidelines for 5 serves per day. And that 27% of people say it's just a personal preference. So a habit or a dislike, those behaviours and preferences, I guess, that form over time. Cost was only identified as being an issue for 11% of people, and quality and availability didn't really factor in here in general. I'm going to look at those 2 reasons now in more detail though, because this is where we really start to see some inequities across the Shire. So for cost, we can see that it was a significant issue for people in Lancefield, that 20% of people in Lancefield identified cost as the reason why they weren't getting their 5 serves per day. And similarly, for quality and availability, we see people in Lancefield identifying, or 1 in 10 people identifying that that was an issue for them in having access to fresh, affordable foods. The cost was also put forward as a barrier for people with poor health, people with low life satisfaction, and people with financial insecurity. So again, we know that those characteristics are also associated with not meeting guidelines. So we know for those people who we really want to boost veg consumption in, that cost is a key barrier for them. So moving now to fruit consumption, I'm not going to spend quite as long on fruit consumption. The reason being that we're performing a bit better in this space. That about 1 in 2 people in the region and also in our Shire are meeting the fruit consumption guidelines of 2 pieces per day. We have a similar proportion of people who are having no serves at all, so just under 1 in 5, 16% in the Shire and 18% in the region. When we look at how we stack up to our neighbouring LGAs, we can see that a lower proportion of people in Macedon Ranges weren't meeting guidelines, so we were performing a bit better. Let me start that again. We're performing worse than Mount Alex, but sort of comparable to some of those other neighbouring areas. In Mount Alex, they achieved 54% of people who met fruit consumption guidelines, significantly higher than our 49%. Again, looking within the Shire, those differences we start to see between districts didn't reach statistical significance. So it does appear to be that little bit of a pattern of lower consumption in Lancefield, Romsey, but there's sort of too much fuzziness around those numbers to say with confidence it's not due to chance. So looking again at who's meeting fruit guidelines, the guidelines of fruit consumption, how that varies according to gender and across the lifespan, we can see that for our young people, there's significantly higher consumption than all other age groups. So we're doing really well at making sure our kids eat the recommended amount of fruit. I think that's a really great story to tell as well, to really congratulate people for helping our kids to have a healthy diet. It starts to drop off then from adolescence into young adulthood. sort of lowest at young adulthood, but not really recovering from that point to around 1 in 2 meeting the guidelines. We see a really similar pattern of meeting fruit consumption guidelines with other health indicators. So exactly as we saw for those less likely to meet veg consumption guidelines, lower proportion of people with poor health, those who say they don't feel valued by society, people who need help with daily activities, and those who are food insecure, all significantly less likely to meet fruit consumption guidelines than their peers. That food insecurity data comes from our regional report. We see the same pattern in Macedon Ranges, but didn't reach that statistical significance, largely because of the number of people who identified as having gone without food in the last 12 months was a small number and sort of had that bigger error bar around it. Similar to veg consumption, not meeting fruit guidelines is associated with poor diet, smoking, and low physical activity. So again, thinking about these clustering of behaviours and I guess how we can approach them more comprehensively rather than tackling one specific issue, of really looking at health and well-being more holistically, I guess. So we asked a similar question about barriers to fruit consumption, and it shows a similar pattern to what we see for veg consumption. Although more people identified personal preference as an issue, that sort of emerged as the number one issue, identified by 40% of respondents, versus 18% saying they were time poor. And I guess fruit is a snack you can tend to, grab from the bowl without needing too much preparation. So that makes sense. Here we see that 14% of people identified dietary reasons or restrictions as being the reason they didn't meet those guidelines. 11% cost, so similar to veg. 9% that they weren't aware of the guidelines, and 6% identifying quality or availability. We didn't see the same patterns of disadvantage according to where people live in our fruit consumption barriers. So quality and availability and cost, those didn't, there wasn't any variation in those as issues across our community, across our district. So I haven't broken that down any further, looking at how they vary across our shire. There weren't any differences in those key barriers. I'm moving on to water consumption. This is a little bit of a tricky one because there aren't really any guidelines as to the recommended amount of water consumption. It really varies based on your health and other your health, age, and other factors. So what I've reported here is not whether or not guidelines are met, but how many cups per day people are having on average. And you can see that Macedon Ranges, on average, people were reporting 5 cups of water per day, and that there wasn't a whole lot of difference across the Loddon Campaspe region, but slightly higher average amount of water per day in Greater Bendigo than Campaspe, Mount Alex, Central Goldfields. Within our shire, again, we saw a slightly higher average of cups per day in Gisborne than Romsey. I think rather than focusing too much on this, what's interesting is perhaps some of the other behaviours that are associated with lower water consumption. And here we see in particular an association with sugary drinks. And that's certainly a behaviour that we could help to offset. So swapping the sugary drinks for water for much better health outcomes. We also see a pattern where water consumption declines with older age. It's difficult to unpack that. The question that was asked was specifically about water consumption and didn't really give any guidance as to whether or not to include water that's in tea or coffee. So people might have interpreted that question in different ways. I'll move on to sugar sweetened beverages because I think there are some clearer actions to take from this data. So this question asked about consumption of cordial soft drinks, flavoured mineral water, energy or sports drinks, and the frequency that people were having these sugar sweetened beverages at. And we can see that in the region, 14% of people reported daily consumption of sugary drinks, and in our shire it was 10%. So when we compare, we were actually performing better on this measure. So significantly lower proportion of people in Macedon Ranges were having sugary drinks daily than Greater Bendigo, Campaspe, Central Goldfields. Again, you kind of see this juggling up and down of where that proportion sits across districts within our shire, but there weren't any statistically significant differences. We do start to see some differences when we break it down across their lifespan and also this gender analysis. So it becomes quite obvious that the sugary drink consumption is much higher among males than females, and it really, peaks around that 12 to 17 and then sustains at quite a high level. So we could certainly be doing something with our adolescent males to really talk about the health consequences of sugary drinks, or create, ways to try and encourage swapping those drinks for water, making sure that water is available throughout the day as well. Sugary drink consumption is also higher for adults with poor self-rated health, those who require help with daily activities, people who are overweight and obese, only just sneaking in there, and also those who are food insecure. And that data is regionally, again, we see the pattern in our local data, but it didn't quite reach significance. So very similar patterns to what we see with poor diet generally. So I guess all of these consumption behaviours can really be addressed holistically when we're talking with different people about the importance of food for well-being. We have this really valuable data from the Active Living Census on food insecurity. And the question that we're asked, so this is at a household level, and households identified whether or not they had run out of food and couldn't afford to buy more in the past 12 months. So that's what we're calling food insecurity. We can see here that in the Macedon Ranges, 6% of households identified that they'd been food insecure, that they'd run out of food at least once and couldn't afford to buy more. We don't have the results on statistical significance testing for this, but you can certainly see that that proportion is lower than where we see elsewhere across the region, particularly compared to Central Goldfields, where 15% of households identified that they were food insecure. However, when we start to look across the Shire, differences based on where those households were located, we see that Romsey emerges as having the highest proportion of households that were food insecure, so 13% of households in Romsey, compared to only 4% in Gisborne and 5% in Macedon Wood End. So we start to see here some of those patterns of disadvantage, but also possibly some of those issues with access and affordability emerging that we saw as real barriers for vegetable consumption meeting guidelines as well. So I guess when sort of thinking about these results, it's important to look, beyond what's happening for individuals based on their circumstances, to what's happening at a level of the community. What do people have access to? What programs exist? What initiatives? What's happening in the local economy? Obviously, right now, during this pandemic, there's a higher demand on food relief. And certainly, I imagine if we ask this question about food insecurity again in a few months, that proportion would be much higher because of those economic factors that are affecting our families and our households. Also really important to think more broadly about the food systems that exist within our local environments, both at a local level and a global level as well. We don't necessarily have power over all of these things, but they certainly influence how those decisions, how those patterns of behaviour filter right down to the individual. So it's not just about behaviour change, but it's about thinking about how we can change the environment to make those behaviours, habit and routine, to make sure that there aren't any barriers due to cost or accessibility, that there's good access to fresh, affordable food. So we've talked through now the guidelines, some of the barriers to meeting fruit and veg consumption, a little bit about consumption of water and sugary drinks, and some information on food insecurity. I don't have the same detailed information on food insecurity, partly because it was measured at a household level. So some of those individual associations don't quite hold when we're talking about household data. But it has been flagged as an area that people want to know more about. So Healthy Harder Victoria initiative is interested in looking into what more information we can provide community groups to support their work in that space. So we'll just go through a little bit of a summary before we open it up to any questions and discussion. So we found out today that only 1 in 7 adults meet guidelines for vegetable consumption, about 1 in 2 guidelines for fruit consumption, and that's here within our shire. We know that 1/4 of adults have fewer than 2 serves of vegetables per day. So more males are missing out, so 28% of males have less than 2 serves of veg per day, compared to 23% of females. And the proportion of people with that low level of vegetable consumption is highest in Romsey at 33%. We also see that veg consumption is associated with financial and food insecurity, as well as with poor health. Time and personal preference were identified as the biggest barriers to fruit and veg consumption, but those barriers really differ depending on personal circumstance, depending on where you live and the other things that are going on in your life, those social determinants. Cost and availability, for example, was more of an issue in Lancefield and Romsey than elsewhere in the Shire. Food insecurity was a bigger problem, similarly, in Romsey, Lancefield and Kyneton than elsewhere in the Shire. And we see that looking at sugary drinks, that about 1 in 10 adults have sugary drinks daily. It's a problem for males more than it is for females, similar to that low level of veg consumption. And it's also associated with low water consumption. So there might be something we can do to try and encourage swaps in those behaviours. Another benefit we can have from that, other than the clear advantages for health, with the high rate of obesity we have in the Shire, is also impacts on reducing our use of single plastics, which often sugar sweetened beverages are sold in. So that's another incentive, I think, to really be considering those impacts on climate and health. So all of the results that I've presented today, they're very detailed findings, are found in the top line report. So that's the one that's about 150 pages long, which can be a little bit overwhelming, but it really drills down all of those outcomes. It cuts the data according to various demographic and social descriptors. So if you really want to know the findings for a particular town or population group, you'll find all of that there in the top line report. The selected findings report that's featured there on the right, that includes much more user-friendly data. So it's a useful one, I think, if you're talking to groups or sharing findings with community. It does include data on food insecurity, as well as fruit and veg consumption and barriers according to according to where people live, as well as for key population groups, including our kids, adolescents, older people, people with disability. I think they're the key ones. We have some other population groups that are reported regionally that we just didn't quite have the numbers to report to include in the selected findings report for the Shire. So if you're interested in data for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, for example, you'll find that in the regional report. Similarly for people who speak a language other than English. So there are some, also LGBTQIA+. So those community groups where the numbers wasn't quite high enough to report at a Shire level, there's a bit more detail in our regional selected findings report.